Kyle, thank you very much indeed for coming onto the webinar series. Could you just give us a brief background as to what you do in your background with aerodynamics and car engineering, please?
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Robert. So a bit of background on myself. I'm an aerodynamicist by trade. I worked in Formula One at Mercedes for 2018, 19, and 20. And now I run a consulting firm doing aerodynamics analysis and design of aerodynamics kits for cars for various motorsport classes around the world. So time attack, touring cars, all that sort of stuff. And that's my primary business. Now I also do a lot of side projects in terms of looking at flows in other areas, in various projects like lawnmowers, biomedical applications, and things like that. So just all across sort of fluid analysis and things like that. And yeah, on the side, I run a YouTube channel, Kyle.Engineers, largely where I do aerodynamic analyses, but I also do a bit of suspension and mechanical technical content on that. I think that's more or less the rundown.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, and I also follow the Mercedes F1 channel as well. It's one of the other few channels because they've got a lot of good technical content there. A question from Trevor: will this be applicable to large boats, trailers, and so forth? I guess largely yes, but we'll maybe discuss that in a bit more detail. Okay, so there's you can ask questions anytime using the Q&A, but as no one has asked one yet, I'm going to launch into this because I'm not an aerodynamicist, but I am an ex-pilot, so I did study aerodynamics a bit. One of the interesting things is I find is that how much people don't understand what an aerodynamic shape is. So we've got three very well drawn, I like to say, trailers here, A, B, and C. And I have put on trailer B a sort of curved fairing at the front, and I put one at the back at C. And which do you think would be least drag? I reckon most people would go for B, but is that the right answer, Carl?
Yeah, I would be inclined to go for B as well. And I think I can use annotate to draw on this.
Yes, you can. Yep.
So generally speaking, the rule of thumb when it comes to aerodynamics is we go for a round leading edge and a sharpened trailing edge. So if you imagine if I was just doing the ideal shape, it would be something like that, some sort of basically teardrop shape.
Yep.
Now, with these particular caravan shapes, obviously we can't quite achieve full teardropping because we'd have to put the back out of the caravan over here. Somewhere like that, which wouldn't be very good. So what we can do is that you can run something of a squared off trailing edge at the back. And that, generally speaking, leads to a clean flow separation off the back. And then you get basically a virtual airfoil out the back. So the air will start to come in. There'll be a bit of recirculation here. And that will give you a relatively drag-free rear end. So if you went for this rounded approach, what you'd actually end up doing is that you get a lot of curvature of the flow around here, and you still get a separated and lossy region in the center along here. But this curvature here would put quite a lot of suction on this rounded rearwards facing edge there, and that would increase the drag. So generally speaking, we try and get a sharp edge on the rear for clean separation, and that's something a lot of modern cars, hatchbacks, stuff like that in recent years have gone for these. You'll see these little sharp indents on the back. That's the effect they're going for. In terms of the front end treatment, basically there's two components here. One is that the more surface you have not facing directly forwards, the less drag you've got for a given stagnation pressure or pressure at the front of the vehicle. The other part is that with a sharp edge like this here, is you can get basically spill flow where you have the flow comes in, it will stagnate on the front and it will go around like this and it will kick out like this, and we can get a big amount of wake going on here and you get a larger wake on the car. I'm exaggerating most of the flows I'm drawing, but it's more or less like that. With the smoother edge, you won't get that detachment and it will flow down the car a little bit better. And generally speaking, the amount of drag you make is somewhat related to your overall wake size. So my inclination would be to select B of these three available options.
Okay, cool. And just a clarification, when Carl talks about leading edge, that's the bit facing, and trailing edge is the bit at the back. Okay. basically front and lead. Okay, that's cool. So we do see a lot of people concerned about aerodynamic drag when towing, and a lot of people have noticed that the amount of fuel consumption goes up rather rapidly from, let's say, 80 kilometers an hour through to 100 kilometers an hour. And that's a 20% increase in speed, but it's not a 20% increase in drag, is it?
No. So one of the things is the basic formula for any sort of aero force, whether it's lift, downforce, drag, it's always related to velocity squared. So the typical formula we'd use is the overall drag force is a half times the density of the air times the drag coefficient times the area times the velocity squared. And so that goes up with velocity squared. And basically I ran some quick numbers on this, and basically a 10% drag increase, sorry, not 10% drag, 10% velocity increase, say from 100 k's an hour to 110 k's an hour, works out to be around about a 21% drag increase. So it's not quite equivalent in terms of drag reduction versus speed reduction.
Yeah, okay. So basically, there's your rule. Something called the speed squared law. If you double the speed, the drag goes up by 4 times. If you triple the speed, it goes up by 9 times, 4 times the speed, 16 times the drag. And that kind of explains why you go from, let's say, 80 to 100, only 20 k's an hour. It's way more than that because drag's such an important component of energy use once you get to cruising speed. Okay, now the next question is one Andrew Hilliard just asked, one which I had lined up already, which was, we got 3 options here again, and wind deflectors. So which of these is likely to be the most aerodynamically efficient?
Yep, so there's a little bit of it depends to this. A lot of things with aero are a little bit of it depends based on the specifics of your geometry. So I won't give a super straightforward answer, but I will sort of work through the logic of what's going on here. So one of the things that we're always trying to do with any sort of aero to minimize drag is to make the flow trajectory as smooth as possible. So ideally, if I was designing this in a perfect world, what I would do is I would go through and I'd smooth this section here, smooth that into there, and have more or less something like that, right? That's essentially what I would be targeting. Now, obviously, we don't have that, and we can't really have that within the constraints of a 4-wheel drive. But what we want to try and do is, much like we did with the trailing edge in the previous example, is we want to basically mimic this with off-body airflows. So
just explain it again. Off-body airflows. What's that?
Yeah. Sorry, I sometimes get ahead of myself. Basically, if you imagine we have flows that are constrained and bounded along the car's body. So along here, the flow is sort of following the car's body along, and then we transition to an off-body region. Yep. Where we're up in the free stream and we're off the back of the car, and we're trying to manipulate the air and create virtual air surfaces without there being physical surfaces there, and that's kind of what the off-body is. So it's basically flows that aren't on an aerodynamic body, but we're still manipulating them.
Okay, so if I can recap that, where I've put this deflector here, that is made up of metal or fiberglass or something like that. What you're talking about is actually using the airflow to create a virtual one of those. So you're creating a wind deflector made of air.
Yeah, so basically what this particular surface that you've drawn in the first example would do is that it wouldn't just make a block of wind that's going to go backwards like that. What it would really do is it would actually create a block of wind. Well, it would more or less create losses off the back of it that would more or less push up like this. And we're going to try and bridge the gap between these two items. Mm-hmm. And that is basically what we would try to do ideally with one of these deflectors. Because in a perfect world, we'd make the two of them together, right? We'd have a perfect seal between them. So what I would do is like a perfectly designed one of, say, option B would ideally target the losses. We'd probably just round the leading edge of this portion here to make it a little bit more tolerant if we've gotten this wrong. But we would target the losses to impinge just on this leading edge here, because any sort of losses, slow flow off the back of this will hit, well, I mean, they'll be traveling very slow when they hit the front of the Caravan. And when they hit it really slowly, there's not going to be much drag from that. So we want to basically create virtual streamlining. Now, the back of these devices, though, will produce drag. There's no getting away from that. If you've got this big old flat surface here, you're going to make some drag, which is why, ideally, at least in my mind, I would have thought a more efficient geometry would be to go and have the back there and the front at the front. It would kind of look a bit stupid, but you would basically have that sort of geometry there. And then, depending on the distance and the relative height of the car and the Caravan, maybe a little kick up would help, maybe it would hurt, could be a bit draggy. I mean, these things, they're very fine to balance. The smallest geometrical details can actually make quite large differences here, because we don't want to do something like kick our losses up too high here, because if you have too much loss either up high or to the sides, like I spoke about in the first one, extra loss is extra drag. So we don't want to be kicking those flows up too far because we're going to get more drag. So it's a really fine balancing act. It's very tight. And like, to be honest with you, I think that most people, if they didn't understand aerodynamics very well, probably would struggle to DIY something like this effectively.
Yeah, okay. So what you're saying there is that with the examples I've got here, you could actually potentially make it worse.
Yeah, I think particularly with option B, there's a chance that you could make it worse. I think you're a little bit more bulletproof on, because you're still quite low below the top of the rear Caravan. I think you're okay. C is basically, you would probably, like if I was doing this, I'd probably go and I'd round it something like that to just have an edge that comes in behind the car. Like that, because the other thing that you want to do is you want to minimize double stepping. Any sort of thing, like for example, where we have a step like that, and then we have a step like that, each of those leading faces is going to have drag on it here, and drag on it here. So that's why I'm trying to really smoothen that whole area out. So B has the most potential, I'd say, particularly if you extended it further rearwards. But the odds of getting it right are poor. And also, you got to think about crosswind as well. If you terminate the trailing edge on this forwards, and there's a problem on A too, less so on C. But if you get a side wind, the side wind can blow your losses out the side, and that will result in large aerodynamic differences in crosswind, which are probably not ideal from a towing perspective. No. Okay, so the message I'm hearing pretty clearly there is this is a very complex area. There's a lot of what ifs, and you could easily have no effect at all, and even a detrimental effect, and that's purely for drag reduction. And then that's even before we get into the question of Caravan stability and side winds and everything else. Yeah, precisely. I'd say that, like, if you wanted a bulletproof option where you're probably not going to ruin anything too much, C with a bit of rounding is probably the safest option.
Yeah, okay. So that's a message to all the people out there who are busy fabricating bits of sheet metal in their sheds. What looks good isn't necessarily actually good from an aerodynamics perspective, and you could actually be going backwards, and there's no real way to tell unless you engage Kyle in his consultancy. So yeah, I think that's a good message there. But let's just carry on from something you said earlier, Kyle, which is about stability. So you've seen Caravan sway where, and a lot of the people watching this have seen my work on Caravan sway already, and that's where the trailer just starts to oscillate in increasing amplitude until everything's upside down and you're being cut out of your Caravan by the SES. It's really not a good outcome at all. So what effect, if any significant does aerodynamics have on caravan sway? And I'm thinking here, let's talk about initiation. So you're driving along in your caravan, and you're doing 100 k's an hour. Coming towards you is a B double, also doing 100 k's an hour. Now, the way I think about it is like a B double coming through air is like a super tanker going at high speed through water, just this massive wake there, and you're going to hit that wake. So can you talk to us about what happens aerodynamically when that caravan sort of passes side by side with a B double?
Yeah, so I think that the first thing that needs to be discussed is that every body has essentially a center of pressure on it, if you will. So if you have something like an airfoil, you'll have, when it creates lift, it will have a center of pressure that force is essentially applied around. That center of pressure can be forwards or rearwards, depending on the geometry of the airfoil. A caravan, like we discussed earlier, is not dissimilar to an airfoil. It's just a slightly worse shape, but it is pretty similar. And the result of that is that it does have a center of pressure, a lateral force center of pressure. When it's caught by a side wind or basically the wake off, well, the bow wave, if you will, off BW. It's not quite a wave, but it is essentially a side wind locally produced by your truck going by you. Mm-hmm. Now, if that center of pressure is forward of the rear axle or the rear center of gravity, depending on the vehicle dynamics setup of the caravan, it will mean that as the side wind hits it, it will push and rotate the caravan sort of out away from the wind. If it's rearwards, it will rotate the caravan into the wind. Now, in terms of sway initiation, I guess that depends a little bit on where your center of gravity position is. And I mean, I'm not that well up on center of mass effects on the sway. I've seen your video, but what would you think is the initial defining force that would cause the sway? Is it, well, the sway issue, is it just any force in any direction, or is there a particular direction with respect to the car's motion that's important?
I think it's any sideways force seems to be what gets sway going. I've watched a lot of videos, talked to a lot of drivers about it, and where that force comes from, it could be aerodynamic, it could be a bump in the road, it could be a change of direction from the tow car, it could even be the load moving around in some cases. That's enough to get it up. And the nature of sway is interesting because it gets worse over time. It doesn't damp out, it gets progressively worse. And you've got about 3 seconds from when it starts to when it's out of control. I've just edited that diagram there, and I just want to replay something you said. So if this red circle here is the center of gravity, which is typically just above in a tandem axle, probably about there somewhere. The center of pressure. Now, the center of pressure is like the center of gravity, but for aerodynamics. In other words, if a wind blew on the side of this, the forces of it could be said to be acting at this red dot here, which I really should have made a different color. Sorry about that. And in the same way that the center of gravity, the weight of an object can be said to be acting around the center of gravity. The center of pressure is kind of the center of gravity for that. So if you've got, I think what you're saying, Kyle, is if your center of pressure is a long way from the center of gravity, then you've got this moment here twisting it, so that when you get a side wind, the further away, and I actually will just change the color of this because it is annoying me that I haven't done it. Let's just reshare this.
Yeah, but basically, yeah, I would imagine that the sway initiation is far more dependent on the positioning of the center of pressure from the center of gravity than it is on the actual, the contact patch maybe, but it's more dependent on the positioning than the actual location in terms of front rear.
But right, so if that's, I've now changed the center of pressure to green. So if it's here, right over the center of gravity, then the caravan will just go sideways. Okay, that's my guess, and that's kind of okay because you've got a force, it's got to go somewhere, right? But let's say we've got the center of pressure all the way over here for sake of argument, then the caravan's not going to go sideways. It's going to rotate around one way, and the further it is away from the center of gravity, the better. And I bet no caravan maker has ever done the calculations to figure out where the center of pressure is to make sure it's lined up with the center of gravity, and that would aid stability. That would be my guess.
Yeah, I would imagine so. I think one thing that's worth noting is that there's only so much we could do on the Caravan to correct the center of pressure. We could probably do a little bit of nose cone work. I imagine would help, but well, actually, it might make it worse when you go to do that nice drag reduced nose. The curvature and improved flow quality around that front is almost certainly going to shift the lateral center of pressure forwards.
Yeah.
So that could very well be a problem from a stability perspective.
Yeah, look, and everything we're discussing here, I mean, the ideal shape, as Kyle said, is a teardrop, but that's almost the opposite of an ideal shape for anything practical. You want a square, box type shape for a caravan, which is the wrong shape for aerodynamics, and it's wrong. So everything's a compromise, right? So we're not really criticizing caravan makers here. It's more just exploring potentials and ideas.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I think the other thing too, and I'm not sure if you were planning on moving to this, but I think the forwards rearwards positioning of the center of pressure for me, the first thing that struck me as is the stability in terms of divergence criterion once you have entered the sway. So I would imagine that if you had a really forward center of gravity and you've got the caravan turned at quite an angle, the side wind that is produced on the front of the caravan would try to yaw the caravan even more. And that would make it diverge a little bit more in terms of sort of jackknifing with the carb. I would imagine that in terms of settling the sway once it's begun, having it further rearwards would be quite beneficial.
Exactly. And one of the things I'm trying to educate people on is not to, and this is the red circle as the center of gravity, it's not to have the center of gravity all the way over here for exactly that reason, because there's this massive distance between the center of gravity and where the caravan is pivoting, which makes it stable in a straight line, arguably too stable, but also makes it harder to recover from sway. But until we had this conversation, I hadn't really thought about the center of pressure relative to the center of gravity. And you're right, that having that over the center would be perfect as well. Yeah. Okay, question from Tony Collins, interested in the impact of crosswind on stability. We talked about that a bit just now. Gradual exposure and sudden, and also what defines a center of pressure. So any comments on Tony's questions?
Yeah, I think there's just two more comments for me to add on the crosswind and stability things, which are, yeah, it is a good point that the transient application of crosswind by a truck is different to a wind-based crosswind, because if you have a wind crosswind, that will apply to the whole side of the caravan at the same time. So your regular center of pressure will apply. So you'll have a center of pressure that's defined by the geometry, and that will be acted on as you'd expect. But if you have a truck pulsing past, you'll have the crosswind will hit the start of the caravan and then will progress down to the rear. So almost regardless of where you've designed your center of pressure to be, you're almost certainly going to get the torque act at the start, and then it's going to go and swing around to the back. And that transient force, I don't know there's a huge amount you can do in terms of design, apart from trying to reduce your overall side force magnitude. In the same way that you try and reduce the overall drag force, you can try and reduce the overall side force with similar techniques. So maybe filleting the top might help a little bit. There's probably a few little things you can do with the sides of the caravan to make that a bit better. But yeah, that you're a bit at the mercy of what you're being hit with.
Actually, that's a really good point. So what you're saying there is when that B double is oncoming, it's going to first of all hit the front of the caravan, and then it's going to hit the side and then the back. So you're going to get this sort of yawing effect no matter what. Whereas if it's just a side wind, that's going to hit all parts of the caravan quite equally. So it's actually quite a different sort of experience there. And I guess if you had, okay, now something else to consider that. So when that B double has gone past, right, and it's just the back of the B double has passed the back of your caravan, there's this massive trailing wake there and in effect an area of low pressure. What effect does that have on caravan stability?
So it would just be essentially the same effect, but just in reverse, more or less. It's worth noting too that the B double going the opposite way to you is quite a high frequency effect. Like if you think about how fast you're passing, it's a very short impulse. Like it shouldn't be long enough to gain any sort of significant momentum in the caravan before it's passed. Whereas if you were to say be overtaken or overtake a B double, I'd imagine that being a much lower frequency movement, far more in the realm of at least the sway videos that I've seen. I imagine that that's more likely to cause an aerodynamic induced sway oscillation than having the BW pass you going the other way.
Okay, yeah, interesting. Yeah, but I think as we were discussing this before this started, we agreed that weight distribution's more important than aerodynamics. And the thing about overtaking, when you overtake the caravan, you're doing a lot of things to induce sway. One is you're speeding up, because the faster you go, the more likely you are to have sway and more energy you have in the system. So there's that. Then you're changing direction to move out, and then you're changing direction back again. So you're doing and in fact, and also when you pull back in, once having completed your overtake, you're slowing down and you're changing direction, both of which are likely to induce sway. So this is why overtaking with a caravan is risky. Possible, but risky. Okay, question from Robert. Putting a soft bag or roof pod on the car near the back, would that help air go over the van or cause turbulence? That was kind of what we did in the first one. So I think we'll say that we've answered that one, as well. Now, I do have a graphic here which I wanted to show you. So you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but for those not overly familiar, I've created 3 oblongs here, and you hear the term CD, or coefficient of drag. Can I just explain what CD is? Because you hear a lot about that in car, well, in fact, with EVs nowadays, and how drag coefficient cars are.
Yeah, so I mean, drag coefficient is it's a bit of an arbitrary number, really. It's just a number that we pick to express how much drag a car is creating. And the way that I prefer to express it as is a CDA, which is the coefficient of drag multiplied by the frontal area of the car, because that's a direct comparison to anything of what the drag is of the car. So it's just a term that we use in our equations to multiply out and tell us how much drag is being produced. One of the problems with using just CD instead of CDA is that you can make a car have worse drag and more frontal area, but still have a lower CD. And I know of at least one manufacturer that does do this.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the bit. So when you look at CD, so let's say a small car with a CD of, let's say, 0.5 could have less drag than a large car with a CD of 0.2, because it's all related to frontal area.
Okay. Yeah, precisely.
Yeah. Now, tell me if I got this right or not, but basically that would be a CD of about 1. And then if we put a circle around it, then it should back to about 0.5. And this is my excellent CFD derived sort of turbulence here. So there's less turbulence here. And then if we go for this beautiful streamline shape I spent many seconds on, that goes to about 0.5, and there's no turbulence at the back. So is that about right aerodynamically?
I mean, to be honest with you, it's one of those things that, like, it's like how you forget your times tables once you have access to a calculator. I don't think any professional aerodynamicist would be able to tell you any of these numbers off the top of their head. I certainly can't remember. Those numbers seem ballpark reasonable. Perhaps your airfoil drag is maybe a little bit low, but I think that seems ballpark for me.
Yeah, okay, so cool. So the thing to take away from the watches is that something like this is high drag, but the more that you sort of allow the air to sort of smoothly come back in like this, then the less drag you're going to get. But obviously having everything shaped like a teardrop is very ineffective. And my favorite example is look at the fairings around light aircraft wheels. Those of them that bother with them, that is, they're all teardrop shaped, and so that's the ideal there. But there's so many reasons you can't get to that in cars or anything else. If you look at things like a Prius, they tend to be a little bit teardrop shape, and Tesla X's, and Land Rover Defenders not so much. Okay, next question. Is it correct to presume that a pop top will have less drag and other issues? So what he's talking about there is a pop top Caravan. So basically what we're talking is a van which isn't as tall as it would normally be. So if that's your normal van there, what would happen is that you would, when you stop, you would sort of extend it out, and then that bit would pop up, and then when you're traveling, that bit would sort of fold down, sort of like so. So would there be less drag, and if so, do you think it would be significant?
I think that if we're using the reference height as when the roof is popped, we're saying that that's the same as a full body Caravan otherwise.
Yep.
And then we're dropping the roof to a lower level. But I think it's fairly safe to assume that drag force and side force are all going to drop. So it should just be aerodynamically superior, because when we talk about how we're talking about the whole CDA thing, when you drop the top, we're not really changing the overall geometry that much. We're just sort of shrinking it. So our area's gone down, so that's beneficial. We're also pulling it more into the wake of the car, because we're not sitting as above the car. So we'll naturally have those losses that we were talking about ages ago go and impact the front, and we'll all be quite low drag. So yes, I think that's a pretty safe assumption to make.
Yeah, okay. Now, I am aware of a test done by a Caravan magazine, and they actually measured pop-top, non-pop-top, and they found there was a measurable difference, but not vastly. The other interesting thing is that when that's up like now, let's say it was a full-size Caravan, and we're talking about that, then you've got a greater area for that B double or whatever else to push against, and also your center of pressure would probably come up like that as well, and you want that nice and low. So lowering it down, it should be more stable and more aerodynamically efficient as well. But like I say, the one example, that one test I've seen said there was a difference, but not a massive difference.
Yeah, I think that with results like that, it's always worth keeping in mind as to whether or not there are other geometrical differences. Because of course, if you had a pop top that had a terrible shape below the pop top, well, then obviously it's going to get outperformed. So
yeah. Look, I don't know. I think they just had two identical cars, or maybe the same car, and towed it around the same thing. But the wind conditions would have to be exactly the same, because if the wind was different, then that would have a measurable effect on drag as well. So I don't know how scientific it was, but yes, I think the answer is definitely that. Okay. Any other final comments you want to make, Kyle, about the subject of aerodynamics? So let's say that you're a Caravan owner and you're thinking, look, is there any quick, easy things I can do to reduce drag, improve sort of stability of my Caravan aerodynamically, or is it really just not worth bothering and you're better off just having a beer?
I mean, I'd probably leave it to the manufacturers and have a beer for most of it. I think that if you're looking for drag, feel free to smoothen off a whole bunch of stuff on the front, but just be aware that there may be some stability issues. And just keep that in mind. And then when it comes to the rear, I think that as long as your edges are fairly sharp, trailing edged, and you've got a fairly square back, I think you're kind of just in the ballpark for what you can do there.
Yeah, okay. And remember that if you're after trailer stability, the best thing you can do is weight distribution, and look at my videos on that and know how to get out of sway when it happens. And if you want to save fuel, the best way you can do that is to knock 10 kilometers off your speed. But if you're going to do that, please be mindful of other road users, particularly if they're driving Orange Rangers or Orange Lotus Elises. Actually, not so much in the Elise because I can get by anyway, but particularly Orange Rangers, do let them by. Okay, so I think that we'll bring it there. So Kyle, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to talk to us. It's been absolutely fascinating and invaluable, a subject we don't often get to explore. Please, everyone, do take a look at his channel. I'll be putting that on my tagged on my Facebook page already, and that will be linked in the video description. So thank you again, Kyle, and all the best with your aerodynamic consulting.
Yeah, no problems at all. Thanks for having me.
Okay, thanks everyone. Good evening.
Bye.